Greetings, colleagues. My name is Bridie Lee Bartlett, and I am the Director of the Queensland Conservatory and Research Centre here at Griffith University. I'd like to begin this message by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands upon which the QCRC is located and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now at QCRC, there is much excitement and anticipation around the launch of the new book, Difference and Division in Music Education, edited by our very own and wonderful QCRC colleague, Dr. Alexis Kallio. This book undoubtedly makes a unique and timely contribution to the field of music education by interrogating contemporary conceptualizations of hate and their manifestations in various teaching and learning contexts. It is an engaging and thought-provoking read that I think will certainly challenge music educators to ask deep and profound questions about the politics of music education through a very unique perspective, you might say a taboo or dark side, that challenges and enriches current discourses on inclusion, equity, diversity through a far more complex and nuanced outlook. This is a timely topic, not only for music educators, but for society at large, as many nations struggle to come to grips with the realities of growing social divisions, social fragmentation, conflict, and violence. The lineup of authors that Alexis has assembled is absolutely stellar. It's a who's who list of great educators and researchers working in this very space. It represents both leaders in the field as well as early career scholars from many different countries with unique and insightful perspectives and experiences. This book is also a great testament to the body of work that has been led by its editor, Alexis Kallio. Her work has highlighted the need to attend to often neglected aspects of music education research that focus on inclusion, diversity, and social justice. Her work brings a truly interdisciplinary and innovative perspective to the topic of difference and division. It breaks traditional boundaries to see things differently, and one could argue better, and to argue for the potentials of music education to bring about positive change. So on behalf of the QCRC, I send my warmest congratulations to Alexis and her stellar team of authors. This is a fantastic publication that will no doubt make a great mark in our field. Bravo.
I think that the initial idea for this book came about already during my doctoral studies, when I was looking at repertoire selection processes in light of the democratic and inclusive ideals of Finnish schooling. Now, one of the interesting findings of this research, particularly as to why teachers would exclude certain musics that they saw as inappropriate for teenage students, was that it was part of establishing a moral boundary of their classroom. As such, inclusion and exclusion were not necessarily polar opposites. It wasn't an either-or, but rather that both were employed in order to define who we are, what the values of teaching and learning are, and who we hope that our students become. Now, I think that our field is often in general agreement as to what an ideal music education might be. It's something that is equitable, democratic, inclusive, culturally responsive, and so on. But I think that there's only so much that we can learn through being in agreement. As Hanif Qureshi has argued, it is through consensus that inequality is concealed. So in searching for inequalities, I proposed this book as a way to dive into some of the divisions and look at the maybe darker flip side of music education in order to open up possibilities for new ways of thinking and acting. Now, the working title for this book for quite a long time was Engaging Hate in Music Education, which was deliberately provocative. Now, that title, along with some of the themes in this book, might seem irrelevant, a little bit negative, or wholly melodramatic to many. However, I think that few of us would disagree with the UN Secretary General's observation that hate is no longer something that exists in the shadows of society, but has moved into the mainstream. Although many of us are living in one of the most peaceful periods of history, social division is very much on our doorsteps. Furthermore, governments around the world have acknowledged that punitive reactionary responses to hate are largely ineffective and have positioned education on the front lines to instill certain morals and values in children in promoting a healthy and civil society. Now, if we think also of the transformative potentials of music education to encourage youth to see things differently, to speak back to their worlds and to effect positive change on their communities, I think that our field is well positioned to interrogate the values that shape what we do and what shape the societies that we belong to, in attending to the political and ethical dimensions of teaching music to change the world. Now, the first step in doing this, I think, is to conceptualize the phenomenon itself. And I think it's interesting to note that the extant literature on music and hate, or even some music education and hate, doesn't really engage with wondering what that concept is itself. Now, while the chapters in this book approach hate and social division from varying standpoints, I think all of us move beyond thinking that it's something abnormal or monstrous reserved for people wholly unlike ourselves. Similarly, it's not approached as a fleeting emotion that we all feel at some time or other, something that really doesn't matter that much. Rather, I think hate is positioned as part and parcel of intergroup conflict that happens anyway, a process by which difference is defined and dividing lines are drawn. The authors in this volume examine the ways that music teaching and learning construct, maintain, or challenge notions of propriety, explore the underlying values and cultures of violence that give rise to expressions of hate in and through music and broader society, and also consider what an ethical response to hate in and through music education might entail. In this way, I think that the volume extends contemporary scholarship on diversity in music education and music education as transformative practice by considering the situated and politically imbued values and ideologies that construct meanings of the self and other, and as well as the contested borders by which we shape our purpose and practice in an increasingly diverse and divided world.
Throughout my scholarship, up until the point of the chapter, I have always felt a bit of an unease, which I didn't know what exactly it was, and I really couldn't pinpoint it, but all my scholarship throughout, up until that point, somehow point to that direction, until I read two pieces of articles, one in New Yorker and one in The Guardian, one by Jelani Cobb, and the other one by Dina Nayeri, both wonderful writers, talking about the consequences of ingratitude and what does even feeling grateful mean for people who have been historically marginalized, such as Black people in the US and also immigrants or asylum seekers. This one, Dina Nayeri, is from Iranian descent. These two really highlighted what I was feeling unease about, and it made me think more, and it gave me the green light, and also kind of an explosion happened in my thinking when I read these two pieces, and I realized this is something that I would really like to talk about. That feeling of unease, constant feeling of unease, which was actually the expectation, or my idea of people's expectation of me to feel grateful. And when I discussed the whole matter with Alexis, and I got her full-on scholarly support, she really encouraged me to write about this and delve into this matter of what it is all about. And I started to talk to other music teachers and some students about this idea, and I realized that I'm not alone in this. And this is a more systemic situation that a lot of people are going through, and I wanted to really dig out what it was. So when I'm talking about grateful, being feelings of gratitude, I don't necessarily mean, or basically I don't mean feeling grateful, because it's a genuine feeling that is a thriving encouragement in people's lives. And I don't mean that in the chapter. I mean the expectation or the feeling of indebtedness that feeling gratitude would bring upon people who don't necessarily feel like they need to be grateful, because some educational affordances, I believe, are not or should not be considered as luxury so that one person feels like they are grateful for it, but it should be kind of an educational right. And it should be a given. For example, when we're talking about being culturally responsive or bringing more diverse musical cultures into classroom, or subcultures for that matter, I don't necessarily mean that these are luxuries. These should be taken for granted situations in any educational domain, in music learning situations. So feeling grateful for such events is basically, I'm arguing in this chapter, is sugarcoating the bigger problem, which is imposing the feelings of gratitude on people who are normally and or usually and historically been disenfranchised. And also these days, with the whole neoliberal agenda of education, we see a lot of music teachers and a lot of arts educators are being left out and they also feel alienated. And all of these, and when the precarious lifestyle they have as a music educator makes them feel grateful when they have a position and a job to do, which shouldn't be that way. Educators and music educators specifically, they need to have that space that so that they don't feel indebtedness to the fact that they actually have a job, but actually put that all aside and they think about the things that really matter in educational milieu, right? Like having fun with the students and making music and creating music and talking about it, like really getting entrenched in the whole music making endeavors, rather than, oh my god, I have to be in this class and then I don't know if I have my job the day after or so. And then instead of a thriving educational moment, it becomes sink or swim situation that takes away the joys of learning. So when I'm talking about ingratitude, I don't mean that we should be entitled. And that's exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about in the chapter. I'm exactly talking the opposite of entitlement. That at least in entitlement, one thinks that they have all the rights and all the privileges should be for them. Yet I'm talking about not feeling grateful necessarily for the things that should be there from the first place and is not. And this feeling of indebtedness creates a slippage between the learning moment and the persons involved that takes away the joy of the learning and the real thriving moments of musical engagements. And with that, the mutual respect and mutual responsibility is taken away, and to that matter. And sometimes that mutual responsibility and engagement, especially in educational domain, makes it possible for everyone to, even if struggling, but constructively struggling. That feeling of indebtedness about being grateful doesn't make that a constructive situation. It makes it, and I argue, a hateful ecosystem and also destructive. So this is what I'm specifically talking about in this chapter, that I genuinely feel grateful that Alexis gave me the encouraged me and gave me the space to actually deal with this. And since then, since writing this chapter, I feel much more at ease. And basically this helped me to thinking about the pedagogy of the oppressed and critical pedagogy. I was able to name my problem, and now I have a better view of how to move forward with my scholarship and my teaching and my research. So thank you very much for listening to my blabbers in this wintry day in Toronto. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Now I am wearing a Korean folk costume, which is called Pajichogori in Korean. I am Japanese, but I am interested in Chinese Korean culture, especially their music. When I perform Korean folk music, such as Kumuru and Samurunori, I put on this costume. However, it is not easy to dress this way in Japan because it might be a source of discrimination. For those who don't know much about Chinese Koreans, this term refers to people whose ancestors were from Korea and now live in Japan. Their ancestors came to Japan around the time of World War II. The reason why many Koreans stayed in Japan was due to the effect of colonization. After World War II, Chinese Koreans were discriminated against, especially in housing and employment. This type of discrimination has been reduced over the past 2 decades. However, some discrimination against Chinese Koreans continues. For example, you will easily to find hate speech against Chinese Koreans on some right-wing websites. Chinese Koreans tend to hide their ethnicity to avoid discrimination. In my chapter, I focus on the curriculum and music activities in Sakura Elementary School in Osaka Prefecture. I sought to study how teachers help Chinese Korean children form a more positive ethnic identity. Likewise, I was curious about how teachers help Japanese children respect their Korean classmates' ethnic identity. So I started to do field research in Sakura Elementary School and interview teachers. This school is located in Koreatown in Ikuno Ward of Osaka City. Ikuno Ward is famous as a foreigner settlement area, mostly for Chinese Koreans. Chinese Korean children in Sakura Elementary School join a special ethnic classroom program after school. The ethnic classroom is only for Chinese Korean children. Accordingly, Japanese children cannot enroll in this class. Japanese children study in UNESCO time instead of ethnic classroom to understand Korean and other countries' cultures. In ethnic classroom, Chinese Korean children learn Korean culture and history. From September to December, Chinese Korean children practice Korean traditional dance, theater, Kumuru and Samurunori, wearing beautiful folk costumes. The purpose of performing traditional Korean music is that Korean children know good aspects of their culture and form a positive ethnic identity. Developing a strong positive ethnic identity has the possibility of overcoming discrimination. On the other hand, Japanese children are encouraged to respect Korean culture through appreciating the music performance of Chinese Korean children. This reduces the tendency to discriminate against their Chinese Korean classmates. However, one question remains. Why does Sakura Elementary School divide Chinese Korean children and Japanese children? In this chapter, I consider this issue.
Hello, my name is Andrea Rodriguez from Colombia. I am a researcher on music and peace building. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this book and this launch today. My contribution in this book was the chapter number 3, Internalized Violence and Music Education, an axiological proposal. Citizens in Colombia have endured 6 decades of armed conflict, which has had multiple consequences, including the intense emotional impact on many civilians. My chapter, drawn from my PhD research, explored one such case. that of Sergio, who has able to face up the impacts of violence by way of the musical and psychosocial experience provided at a music center belonging to the Batuta National Foundation, program Music for Reconciliation. Peace Studies has defined three main forms of violence: direct, structural, and cultural. But my chapter considers that the sum of this violence generates a fourth type called internalized violence, expressed in negative sentiments and the constant possibility of unpeaceful reactions. In Sergio's case, the opportunity to make music, the encounter with sounds as a place of expression and tranquility, as well as the sensation of being treated appropriately and respectful by teachers and classmates, became a means for him to regain sense of confidence in himself and trust in others, and a way of reimagining his life. The research identified the elements that brought about this transformation that I call an axiological proposal. These elements are the cohesive intangible resources that are present and circulating in the program ethos, the repertoire, the instructor ethics, positive relation with classmates, making music, and psychosocial activities with children and their families. In this context, collective musical spaces with victims of violence are not simple spaces for practicing or learning musical skills, but also become a place to express and address the internalized violence. Such emotions as sadness, anger, and hate can be accepted as part of the individual process of rebuilding one's life. Equally, if, as in Sergio's case, these places serve to deter people from adding to the spirals of violence and to break the cycles of revenge, this will come to represent an important contribution of peace building. Thank you and have a good day.
Hello, my name is Juliet Hess. I teach at Michigan State University, and my chapter is called Resisting the Us versus Them Dichotomy Through Music Education, the Imperative of Living in the Anti. In the current global climate, given the prevalence of hate and the support that bolsters it in far-right political parties, I argue that there is an imperative for music educators to teach explicitly against hate and oppression, alongside teaching for values that include love and community. My chapter draws upon the political climate following the election of Donald Trump in the United States as an entry point to consider similar far-right white supremacist movements internationally and the manner in which such movements firmly relegate certain populations as so-called less than. In this global political climate, this chapter considers the connection between patriotism and hate and explores what I call toxic patriotism. I utilize a theoretical framework rooted in anti-racism and anti-colonialism to privilege the oppositional approach to oppression. I examine some implications of music education in oppressive nationalist contexts, and then turn toward music's potential, given both its inherent power to bring people together and to push people apart. I argue that music education provides an important opportunity to engage and resist oppression and teach for a different possible imaginary, drawing upon strategies including intentional musicking as a practice of community, facilitating critical conversations, careful textual analysis of music, songwriting as resistance, and the extension of these ideas into the broader community. In the US right now, we are living in a polarized society, bolstered by white supremacy, and these so-called alt-right white supremacist movements are gaining traction across the globe. Many of these movements masquerade as patriotism, and music has long been implicated in patriotism and also participates in what I call toxic patriotism. Recognizing ways that music is implicated in oppression becomes important to engaging music education towards anti-oppression. As a music educator, my corner of the world is music education. In this chapter, I thus seek to imagine ways that music education can be anti-oppressive and can oppose the polarization that we are seeing internationally.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Kertz-Welzel, and I'm the author of the chapter on hating classical music in international music education. The motivation for me to write this chapter was that I was always surprised about the negative image classical music had in international music education. As a classically trained pianist and as a German music educator, of course, I grew up with a different image of classical music, which was very much appreciated and an important part of our music education tradition. So I was wondering what happened in international music education that classical music had this bad reputation, and it's not only an objective image, it's very much emotional. It's about hate. Classical music stands for something. It stands for something which emotionally involves people, and therefore it is a musical culture which is not very much appreciated in international music education. And I wanted to understand why. If you know my chapter starts out with a brief overview of what classical music is and tries to define it not in a way exemplifying that classical music is the only kind of music, but rather describing what classical music is, what distinguishes it from other kinds of music, and where this repertoire comes from. Then I move on to describing or to analyzing the discourse on classical music in international music education. It started out with classical music being the most valued and most appreciated music education content in the 1960s and 1970s, for instance, in Germany and the United States. And later it changed when new lesson content such as popular music or musics of the world got more involved, so that classical music got first marginalized, and then later it became a musical repertoire which was really not appreciated anymore. Then in the next chapter, I try to analyze or to identify reasons for this hate of classical music in international music education. I identify 3 different reasons. First, it is about the fact that students don't like classical music. One of my students, when I was a high school teacher, always said, well, there's not enough beat in classical music, it's boring. So that might be a fact that students don't like it, and then we maybe should not teach it. The second argument basically is that classical music is an elite kind of music, which only certain people could master and play. I refer to ethnomusicologists like John Blaking or Christopher Small. The third and maybe most important argument is that classical music is related to contested aesthetic concepts, such as music for its own sake. This kind of concept is an enemy, for instance, in praxial music education, where it's very much about transforming society and making an impact on the society, and music for its own sake, as related to classical music, would be pretty much about the opposite. Of course, I defend classical music, and I try to show that these arguments against classical music are, of course, not the arguments which would win. So, of course, some students don't like classical music, but so what? They might not like maths, they might not like other kinds of school subjects, but still they have to learn it. And very much depends on the kind of method you use. If you have a creative method, then, of course, students would like classical music. The second argument that classical music is an elite kind of music is certainly also not valued. I refer to Peter Dindal's argument of cultural omnivoreness, said that today it is not a sign of a higher cultural capital that we like certain kinds of music, like classical music, but that we very much like everything. This kind of complete openness is a sign for our cultural education or the way we approach music. The third argument, then, the relatedness to contested aesthetic concepts, or the fact that classical music, for instance, is Eurocentric and would indeed promote another kind of music education philosophy, is not valid anymore, because I refer to Estelle Jorgensen. Classical music is a multicultural musical culture, which has its roots in many different parts of the world, like North Africa or the Arabian countries. And so it's certainly not true to say that classical music is a Eurocentric kind of music, and it is not necessarily connected to different kinds of aesthetic concepts or contested aesthetic concepts. So finally, my main point in this paper is that we should take a close look again at what classical music is, what it really is, and should not be carried away by different kinds of ideas which are connected to classical music. Because many people, many music educators like classical music. And I think it's not okay just to say, well, we don't need it and it might be kind of a scapegoat for something else. So this is basically my paper. And some points which I consider to be really important is the question. First, what does classical music stand for? Is it maybe a scapegoat, something we use even though we mean something else? In international music education, classical music stands very much for music for its own sake, for a kind of approach which is not so much focused on music education as activism for transforming societies, but something which is rather about contemplation, about retreating into a kind of musical sanctuary. So I think that one part of the hate of classical music and music for its own sake is the fact that it's not about transforming societies. And so in this regard, it might really be a scapegoat. And maybe it's time for us to consider the role which music education transforming societies plays. If this is behind the scene and is one reason why classical music is hated in international music education. Lucy Green, and I refer to this, differentiates different meanings of music. And her way of differentiating between an inherent and an delineated meaning of music helps very much to understand what some kinds of musics and the discourse is about. Because classical music and the discourse about in international music education is not so much about the music itself. It's rather about connected meanings, meanings which are related to it, meanings which we assign to classical music, like elitism and different kinds of things. So I would argue, especially in view of the fact that many of us love classical music, and certainly we should be able to admit that we start deconstructing the various discourses about classical music to better understand what our discourses are and what classical music are. Because my goal would really be that classical music eventually becomes one musical culture among many others, one musical culture which is still very much appreciated by many music educators worldwide, and one musical culture which we should also share with our students. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Gareth Dillon Smith, and the title of my book chapter is Rap, Racism and Punk Pedagogy. When Alexis initially invited me to be part of this project, the book was framed as engaging hate in music education. It's since morphed into division and difference. So I approached the chapter from an angle of thinking about hate. So I begin by looking at how hate is an expression of prejudice, and also how hate can be felt, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the intent of the expression for it to be felt as hatred, and therefore to be hatred. So I use hatred to discuss racism in the United States of America, where I now live. And I've been working on the chapter for a couple of years prior to publication, so it's a coincidence that issues of race have become much more prevalent and foregrounded in public discussion this year in particular. So I'm glad they have. Racism is rife in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So, and I'm glad that maybe my paper can be part of that discussion in a small way. So I suggest that rappers are engaging in punk pedagogical praxis in order to address racism through their music. So according to Khan Egan, writing in 1998, there are 5 core tenets of punk. Those are anger and passion, a DIY ethic, destructiveness that calls for attacking institutions, pain, and the pleasure principle. And I explore each of these in the lyrics of 4 rappers. I look at, well, actually a group of rappers and 3 individual rappers. So I look at NWA's Fuck the Police, then KRS-One's Sound of the Police, Immortal Technique's Harlem Renaissance, and then Childish Gambino's This Is America. I try quite hard not to speak for the rappers or speak on behalf of the rappers. Really, it's an exploration of where I see these rappers engaging in punk pedagogical praxis. So there's an extent to which the paper is also a demonstration of my having ascribed to the rappers pedagogic authority, as Bourdieu and Passeron call it. So I've ascribed to these rappers the authority to teach me about how they are addressing issues of hate as racism in the United States. As I was writing the chapter and looking at the words of the raps and listening to the raps over and over again, and I played drums along with the raps in order to hear them in context. I really wish the book were also audio, and that we had links to the raps, and we could, especially in the case of Childish Gambino's song "This Is America," it would be great to watch it. So I urge people to watch YouTube videos for these songs, listen to the music, because it's in the delivery of the lyrics that they come across the best. They lose a lot of their essence, I think, written down in black and white on the page. So I conclude the chapter with a few questions, one of which I pose to you now, which is, do you ascribe to rap music the pedagogical authority to teach you? Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Brian Churchill, and I'm a lecturer of music at New York University, Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates.
And my name is Tuulikki Laes. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center of Educational Research and Academic Development in the Arts at the University of the Arts in Helsinki, Finland. And we are the authors of the chapter Made Invisible, Erasing Disability in Music Education.
This chapter was inspired when Alexis Kallio approached us with a fascinating provocation. How might hatred be connected with music education's response to disability? On the surface, this might seem like an outrageous idea, because as we look to the field, we do see many well-intentioned efforts to bring about inclusive educational practices. But at the same time, we also observe that disability is often treated as a special category. For instance, it's usually presented as a separate chapter in educational methods texts. We also see the same kind of partitioning or decentering in mainstream educational conferences. Disability is rarely given the main stage. And when it is, disability is presented in terms of exceptional grit and determination, stories that seek to minimize or erase disability. Otherwise, disabled individuals are rendered as objects of benevolence and care. In effect, disability is made visible as a way of affirming society's moral worth. In our chapter, we question the deeper significance of invisibility that arises when music is used as a vehicle for overcoming disability, and the potential that this has for cohering a normative or ableist center of music education.
We look to examples of dualistic roles offered to disabled musicians, either the superhero, a source of inspiration to others, or the object of pity, which offers the able-bodied mainstream the opportunity to practice benevolence. As we researched online media, we found a YouTube video of Jason Barnes, a drummer who exemplifies the superhero trope. In this video, he relates his story of losing his arm and his fear that he would never be able to play the drums again. However, with his prosthetic drumming hand, he is known today as the bionic drummer. Not only did this give him a second chance as a drummer, but the prosthesis actually allows him to play with 3 drumsticks. And this is the kind of overcoming that people want to hear about. Through his skillful performance, Jason leverages his disability as a means of making it seem to disappear. But we don't get to see what his life is like when he takes off the prosthesis. And this kind of selective showcasing is an example of how disability is erased by reconfiguring it as a kind of superpower. Of course, it's important that children have role models. However, we are concerned that these kinds of superhero narratives might not be realistic or healthy for everyone. Although such videos set musical agency at the forefront, these might set out potentially false expectations for children, parents, and educators by ignoring the complex ways that disability is performed in music education.
While writing this chapter, we drew upon theorizing disability through intersectional invisibility, Tobin Sieber's ideology of ability, and performativity as this relates to the sociological concept of erasure. With this contribution, we hope that our work will encourage educators to reflect upon potential ableism in their teaching practices and curricula, to recognize erasures of disability and our possible role in these. We hope to fade the hateful dualisms of centered, decentered, regular, special, and so on.
We're very honored to be included among these thoughtful scholars who also advocate for reflecting on difference and division in music education in such diverse and powerful ways.
Our chapter is called The Neoliberal Colonization of Creative Music Education in Cultural Institutions, a Hatred of Democracy.
All welcome. Could this deceptively simple invitation mean more than it says? In recent years, a broad range of cultural institutions, arts organizations, and other venues have increasingly incorporated creative modes of engagement with music as part of their cultural offerings.
The idea of enabling participants with different backgrounds to enter into a process of experimentation with music making has gained in recent years increased momentum. In fact, notions such as public, visitor, or audience can hardly be confined to their received meanings anymore. As the prominence of the role of the audience listener gradually fades away, notions of creative participation begin to take center stage.
Today, it is seen as essential for any self-respecting music cultural institution to join the race in offering cutting-edge, open, immersive educational opportunities. We feel that the joyful celebratory tone that characterizes the discourse that accompanies such openings leaves a little room for critical apprehension.
In an act of subversion of this superficially joyful discourse, in this chapter we examine aspects of the socio-political and policy framework within which musical cultural institutions, creative participation schemes have emerged.
In the chapter, we first provide a brief outline of some characteristic creative music initiatives that set the stage of our discussion. We then attempt a critical framing of the cultural policy framework that has led to the emergence of such initiatives.
In our chapter, we argue that the eagerness of cultural organizations to incorporate music education initiatives that promote creativity seems to adhere to the dominant neoliberal call for the subsumption of every area of public and private life into a market-based logic.
Thus, we emphasize that the neoliberal colonization of creative music participation in cultural institutions may seriously compromise the subversive potential of creativity that has been a core constituent of creative music education.
Our analysis is framed by Jacques Rancière's perspective on democracy. It is also informed by the work of Pascal Gillen, John Baltacino, and Gert Piesta. For the rest, you have to take the risk to read the chapter. Thank you very much. Take care.
My chapter explores how future music teachers can be prepared to navigate the conflicts and divisions inherent in any democratic music education. Many scholars, myself included, have argued that dissensus and conflict ought to be welcomed in the classroom. It's part of how we learn different ways of seeing and hearing and being, and also part of how we might critically reflect on our own musical, pedagogical, and ethical commitments. However, there's been little guidance as to how future teachers might navigate irreconcilable conflicts in the classroom, and the question ought to be raised as to whether teachers should always promote tolerance. In order to do this, I grapple with instances of hate speech and hate music in the classroom. Though this might be on the more extreme end of expressions that teachers might encounter through their work, I think it is an apt focus through which we can critically consider how to engage with the morally intolerable in music education in ways that might uphold thick democracy and the ethic of care that teachers carry to all students. Now, rather than defining hate speech or hate music through a sort of cause and effect relationship with something that affects harm, which I think can be quite difficult to establish, or through legal frameworks which are often narrow and difficult to apply, I consider these expressions as embroiled within broader politics of disempowerment. Now, the challenges that these expressions pose to democracy, interestingly, are not related so much to the endangerment of human rights, such as equality or preservation of dignity, but rather the right to freedom of expression. Political scientist Eric Hines notes that a democracy cannot legitimately penalize expressions solely on the grounds of its odious or dangerous viewpoint. That said, school is a special context, and we carry a particular duty of care to young people who are only just beginning to learn how to engage in moral deliberation and debate. understand their own positionality in the world and how they might mobilize or challenge power structures. We can't then say that everyone or everything ought to be included, that anything goes. But we need to curtail the democratic freedoms of some in order to protect more vulnerable individuals. Dewey describes this as achieving a balance between the liberation of individuals on one hand and the promotion of a common good on the other. However, neither can we simply censor expressions of hate. Indeed, the outright silencing of hate does little to address its effects or pervasiveness and cuts off any opportunities for further inquiry or critical dialogue. Simply hitting the stop button might even exacerbate the politics of disempowerment through the assumption of ethical homogeneity and through emphasizing a failure to conform. So what do we do? Music education, research and practice has taken enormous and important strides in creating new opportunities for minoritized and marginalized individuals and groups to exercise voice. But I think that this is only half of the equation. And education for social change is maybe not so much about new information as it is disrupting the hegemonic ways of seeing through which subjects make themselves dominant. So in this chapter, I argue that the complex moral deliberations that teachers are required to engage in does not only require new opportunities to exercise voice, it also demands that we learn the art of listening. Now, I don't mean to say that we should sit around with our students and listen to hate music or entertain the possibility that hate speech might be true. Neither do I envision listening as something wholly passive or receptive. Rather, through drawing on conceptualizations of listening as dialogical, political, and enacted creatively and with an ethical duty of care, I explore the ways that listening might enable us to demonstrate a quality of tension inherent in the very practice of deliberation. In this way, especially in and through music, listening can be approached as a communicative engagement that takes conflict seriously, while also allowing for joint action. Moving beyond the romance of empathy, listening is a way to take seriously what the other has to say or play without aiming towards consensus. As one way to recognize and engage with each other's complex personhood, whilst also recognizing the capacity for change, also in ourselves, music teachers might not only facilitate the sharing of existing understandings, but a democratic and ethical commitment to one another that may well allow for new visions of solidarity to emerge.